One, two, three. Listen.
You may not even realize it, but computers are everywhere around you. The car that your parents or even you drive, the refrigerator in your kitchen, everything's got a computer embedded in it. The way I see it, computing really is the future.
I am a software development engineer at Amazon. Began making computer games as a teenager and ultimately went to the Yingwu College of Computing.
I did my research in an area called computing education research. So the reason I got into this field is because I was a TA for an introductory programming course when I was at UC San Diego, and I found that a lot of people came in with these preconceived notions about computer science being too difficult, that it wasn't for them, it was only for their smart friends, it was only for boys, and I definitely don't think this is the case.
When I was applying to colleges, NJIT was the obvious choice for me. I'm in college to learn how to be a great computer scientist, and I was convinced when I visited NJIT that this would be the place to do it.
I am director of the NJIT Cybersecurity Research Institute. My particular claim to fame is I ran one of the early implementation teams for a kind of technology called homomorphic encryption. I recently co-founded a startup called Duality Technologies. Dean Craig Gottsman, he has been especially supportive of faculty entrepreneurship. His experience has been extremely useful to me as I integrate students into research that I do that would have broader societal benefit.
In my experience so far, there's been a huge welcoming community between the advisors and the fellow students. Not just fresh undergraduates, but even students that have been in the career for a long period of time and are coming back to school. I think this tight-knit community here at NJIT is really open, and they're here to welcome you, whether you're trying to study or pursue your thesis or dissertation. All these options are available for you, and we're all here to help.
Ranging from the very philosophical to the very technical, there's a very broad range of things that you can do. People normally think of computing as something that only geeks and nerds do, and to some extent that's not completely incorrect, but computing is used in fashion, computing is used in sports. We have several sports-related projects going on. Computing is used in gaming, entertainment, health. There's a lot of different applications for computing.
My classes and my colleagues' classes are specifically designed around the career prospects of the students. The main job market happens to be mobile, augmented, and virtual reality, so we start right on the phone. Mobile development, we move right through augmented reality on the phone, we move into virtual reality on the phone. We give you all the skill sets that you need as a designer and as a developer. I personally came from this college. I found that the quality of education and the price point, its connection, the transportation to New York City was a great opportunity for me for internships.
I have classmates who some went to Google, some are at Microsoft, Verizon, number of various companies. So definitely a lot of opportunity coming out from NJIT.
Greetings from New Jersey Institute of Technology. I'm Mike Smullen, Executive Director of the Alumni Relations Office. I'm pleased to welcome you to our latest Highlander chat with Dr. Yvette Wan in the Yingwu College of Computing, the Toxic Network. Dr. Wan is an Associate Professor at NJIT and a Director of the Social Interaction Lab. Her research is in the field of human-computer interactions, otherwise known as HCI, where she studies the role of algorithms and social interactions in live streaming, esports, gaming, and social media. Dr. Wan has a PhD from Michigan State University in 2013, an MA in journalism from Harvard University in 2009, and has a BA from Ewha Women's University in 2002. She's also a recipient of the 2020 NCWIT Mentoring Award for Undergraduate Research. Dr. Wan, thanks so much for joining us today.
I know that it's very difficult during the pandemic to watch yet another video conference, but I really appreciate your time coming here, learning more about the research that's happening in our college. Today, I'm going to be talking about, the title is A Toxic Network, and it's looking at content moderation in social media. Before I go further, I just want to introduce my lab. I have a lot of PhD, master's, and undergraduate students that I work with, and I'd like to also acknowledge them in their role in supporting a lot of my research. My research is in the area of HCI. I try to understand how people use social systems and examine the effect of using these systems. So it's a combination of communication, psychology, and computing, and is a relatively new but rapidly growing field. And I've been very fortunate to have received over $3 million in research funding so far. My focus is what I call provision of social support through technology. And this is understanding how people exchange social support through various apps, social systems, social media. And this can include a lot of things, including emotional support, informational support, but it could also mean money. So there's a lot of different types of transactions that we're looking at. One of the things that is a very hot topic and a big research area in my lab these days is content moderation. And this has received a lot of public attention recently, especially after Twitter banned former President Donald Trump from Twitter. And you might think, why are platforms doing this? But actually, content moderation has been around since the very beginning of the internet. And so any kind of social media you see, whether it's Facebook or Twitter, YouTube, even Wikipedia, there's content moderation happening. So what does that mean? Well, you might think, well, with advanced technology, why can't AI do it all? And to a certain extent, there is a lot of AI integrated into our current social media. So for example, on certain platforms such as Twitch, it prevents you from even typing an offensive word to begin with. So that's nice because like people like certain profanities or very rude words, people can't even post it to begin with. AI is also used to detect offensive words. A human being going through billions of content, it would take a lot of time, but AI is able to do that very, very quickly. However, there are a lot of limitations. The reason we can't rely completely on AI is because people get very creative. For example, here I have 3 different examples that you can think about. The first one is people using alternative spellings. For example, instead of the word B-I-T-C-H, somebody could write beach, which is, a sandy area near the shore. And in a sentence, a human would be able to see that this is being used in a rude context, whereas an AI may have a little bit of a trouble determining whether, we're talking about the area near water or if we're saying something rude to a woman. A second example is when we replace words with emojis. The emoji itself may not be offensive, but because it's a picture and not a word, people can use it to mask certain rude things from being said. For example, on the right side, you will see the screenshot I took of a conversation that was happening on the social media platform Twitch. And you can see that people are using this emoji of a Black man to indicate rude things about Black people. So you can see in the middle, for example, they've replaced the letter G with this person's face. Now, this is something that the AI would have very difficulty detecting, but a person can look at it and immediately recognize that it is not a very nice thing to say. Finally, we have alternative words or context-specific emojis. For example, this very friendly smiley face with like a hand seems to be very friendly, but actually in China, it's considered to be a very offensive emoji that you would send someone when you're trying to be rude. Moreover, this laughing, crying emoji, a lot of people, especially a lot of older adults, might think, oh, this is somebody just laughing so hard that they're crying. But actually, especially among younger people, it has a very derogatory connotation. So these are things in which we have limitations with our current technology in terms of keeping up with the creativity of humans in terms of how rude they want to be. When we think about content moderation, it is inevitable that human beings are involved in the content moderation. A lot of this happens behind the scenes. Until recently, a lot of people didn't even know that this workforce existed because their work is mainly invisible. in terms of content moderation, we see two types of moderators. We have the commercial content moderators, and then we have volunteer moderators. And it really depends on what platform you're looking at. So for example, if you look at social media such as Facebook, YouTube, or Twitter, we have paid moderators who review content and they make the final decision on deciding what to keep, what to delete, and what to do with the person who posted the rude comment. And in that case, the platforms come up with the rules. However, in a volunteer moderation situation, which includes communities like Twitch, Reddit, and Wikipedia, we have volunteer moderators, most of who are not paid, and then each sub-community comes up with their own rules. So there's a very difference between what happens on these commercial content moderation platforms compared to these volunteer moderation platforms. In commercial content moderation, there's a lot of limitations. I mean, any method has its limitations, but let's just talk about the three main ones. The first one is that it's very hard to prioritize what should be deleted first. There is so much more content than there are moderators looking at the content. So if there's a lot of content, what do we prioritize? So if you look at the box on the right that in orange, I have here listed 6 things that are actually moderated according to Facebook's community moderation guidelines. So these are things that Facebook does not allow on its site. We have child pornography, human trafficking, call for organized terrorism, animal abuse, nudity, and drug distribution. Now, I want you to think about these 6 things and just in your mind, take a second to think about if it were you, what would you delete first? What would be important to get rid of immediately? Now, this is virtual, so it's like really hard to gauge what you were thinking about. But I'm pretty sure that of all the people who are watching right now, we probably have slightly different opinions about what is most important to delete. And that is always the case with this kind of moderation approach, because a lot of people cannot agree on what is the most important thing to get rid of. The second problem is that there's a time gap between when the bad post happens and when the moderation occurs. There's this time in which the post, this offensive post, is up online and people can see it. And this time gap can range anywhere from a few seconds to several days or sometimes even weeks. And so even if we eventually take down something that's very offensive or rude or even illegal, there is going to be this time in which it is actually actively doing harm. Finally, there are uncertain standards. Earlier, I was telling you that on Facebook, nudity is not allowed. However, could there be exceptions? For example, what if it's a work of art? Or what if it's a photograph of a historical moment? These are actual, this may seem extreme, but the 2 examples that I have here were actually controversial examples of content moderation on Facebook because they were taken down and people could not agree on whether or not they should have been taken down or should have been left to begin with. Next, I'm going to be talking a little bit about volunteer moderation. And I want to focus specifically on live streaming as a research content. So we've been doing a lot of research on, of course, various different types of social media, but today I want to talk a little bit about Twitch, which is a live streaming platform. For those of you who are not familiar, Twitch is kind of like YouTube. However, instead of a video that was posted before and you're just kind of watching it now, it's a live, everything is live. So you can go there. If you go to twitch.tv, you can see, tens of thousands of people streaming simultaneously. And what makes this very interesting from a content moderation perspective is that the comments that are appearing next to the video are happening in real time while the person is broadcasting. And so this creates a lot of very interesting kind of technological implications in which the human moderators have to read these comments in real time and make decisions on the fly. And that makes it just so much more difficult than dealing with comments that were posted in a non-live context. So some of the work that I'm going to be talking about is based on over like hundreds of hours of structured observations, as well as interviews with moderators and streamers, both online and in person, and surveys with hundreds of viewers. And before the pandemic, I used to take my students to some of these conventions where the streamers would get together to learn more about this context. Of course, the pandemic has kind of immobilized us for the past year. So that's been a very interesting experience. Live streaming is, a few years ago, it was relatively novel, but now it's everywhere. We see live streaming on Facebook. This is Mark Zuckerberg giving a talk. It's on Instagram, it's on TikTok. And I think that, like, especially with the younger generation, there's this appeal of feeling like more authentic, more genuine, and the ability to interact with a broader audience in real time is very attractive to them. And so I see a lot of this younger generation really flocking towards these live streaming platforms. On Twitch, this human volunteer moderation happens in kind of like a pyramid fashion, where you have the viewers, and then you have the streamer who is producing the content, and the moderators are somewhere in between. And what that means is that they have some control over the interface so that they can ban people, they can block certain messages. But at the end of the day, the streamer is really in charge of kind of making up the rules for what is acceptable in their stream. So what happens is that each stream has a different set of rules. And this indicates the kind of decentralized moderation we see on sites such as Twitch or even Reddit. I'm sure some of you are really familiar with the recent Wall Street Bets situation, where there was a Reddit group who was kind of trying to influence people on what kind of stocks to buy, such as GameStop. This is a really good example of a community that was self-governed, where they had their own moderators, and it was not Reddit telling them what to do. They were making up the rules for their own community. So in this kind of decentralized moderation, we see a little bit of a different dynamic between the people who are moderators and the people who are the users. This is a screenshot that I took of a stream on Twitch. This person is a very popular Canadian streamer. And as you can see, on the right side, there is this chat interface where people can type in real time. And there, people can interact with each other. And the users who have the green sword next to their names are the moderators. And so the moderators are also viewers, but they also have certain privileges that allow them to control some of the content. The moderators use a lot of different tools to help them moderate. And so it's a combination. Some is like AI, but some is a little bit more manual in nature. They can control the chat, for example, like how quickly the chat interface moves. Sometimes when there are too many people talking at one time, it goes so quickly that they have trouble reading it, so they have to slow it down. They could also control the content, for example, flagging certain messages, filtering words, and then they can also control the viewers. And what this means is that they can make decisions on whether someone should be banned completely from the community, or if they get a timeout, for example. And what a timeout is when somebody is just not allowed to speak for a certain amount of time. So there are, those are just a few of several examples of the different kind of technical abilities that the moderators have. One of the limitations of human moderators, and this goes with both commercial content moderators as well as volunteer moderators, but even more so with volunteer moderators, these people are not paid. And it's very difficult to recruit them. So the recruitment process often happens very organically, where the streamer, usually when somebody starts out streaming, they only have 1 or 2 viewers at most. You would be very surprised at how many people are actually on Twitch streaming to 0 viewers. That has always fascinated me about how persistent they are until they actually get that 1 or 2 viewer. So in the beginning, there's not enough people to warrant having a moderator. But as your viewership grows, you have more people talking, then it's really important for the streamer to recruit a moderator, because it's hard to produce content and also be looking at the chat at the same time. Secondly, there are relational difficulties with the streamers. So as you can imagine, a lot of people who want to be moderators do so because they really enjoy the streamer. And sometimes they have expectations of becoming friends with the streamers or like colleagues, but that sentiment is not always reciprocated. So when we were talking with a lot of moderators, they expressed a lot of kind of disappointment in terms of this unbalanced relationship that they have with the streamer, where they're not really friends, they're not really colleagues, they're working for the streamer, but there's a lot of complicated relationship dynamics going on. And then third, coming up with rules and having stylistic differences is a huge issue, especially with very large streams. You see moderators, there are more than one moderator. So some of them have different kind of internal guidelines on what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. For example, I was talking to moderators who are moderating the same stream, and some moderators thought that it was unacceptable to have any kind of profanity, whereas some other moderators thought, that's okay. So it's really hard for even the moderators to get on the same page. So a lot of times they have discussions outside of the stream, they have discussions with the streamer, and this just creates like a lot of complexity in terms of, there's a lot of coordination that needs to happen outside of the stream as well. So even though these people are not being paid, they're certainly spending a lot of time both during the stream and outside of the stream. Fourth, lack of appreciation was a major theme that we saw. It was very funny because the moderators are spending a lot of time working for the streamer. However, a lot of times they're not giving money to the streamer, whereas other viewers might give money. And because some streamers are able to actually make a living off of live streaming. And what was very interesting was that sometimes some moderators had very close relationships with the streamers, but in other cases, the moderators thought that they weren't being appreciated enough. And, they were saying things such as, I've never heard the streamer thank me for anything. And so that is something that we saw among the volunteer moderators. Also thinking of lack of appreciation from the community as well. So that is something that the moderators have to deal with. Finally, psychological tolls from dealing with negativity. I mean, this applies to all moderators, but especially for volunteer moderators, like they're the ones who are kind of on the front line. They're exposed to a lot of negativity. They also receive a lot of harassment from people that have been banned. So for example, let's say that somebody posted something rude and the moderator deleted it, then they get a lot of hate messages from the person whose message was deleted. Moderators, and you might think, well, it's just some harassing messages, but actually some people have even received death threats and doxing. So it's quite a big problem. And because they're moderators, because they're volunteers, it's not like they have any infrastructure for like therapy. So that is a major problem because they're constantly exposed to negativity, but they don't have the structural support to really help them deal with these psychological issues. Another thing, kind of a big takeaway of our research has been that a lot of the focus on moderation to date has been mostly about deleting bad content. And that's why moderators have been described as being custodians of the internet, for example. Like we think of moderators as, oh, these are the people who take out the trash. But actually in our research, we found that moderation goes beyond deleting. This is just this diagram we created of all of the activities that moderators do. And I'm not going to go into each component in detail, but the really interesting thing here to note is that you'll see the yellow highlight in the middle where I put deleting. That's just one of the many, many things that moderators have to do. So even before the bad act happened, they engage in a lot of proactive activities to make sure that to kind of deter people from posting bad things to begin with, to set a good example, to tell people about what the rules are. And we know that, if you tell people what the rules are, they're less likely to violate the rules. And then after the bad act happened, we know that if somebody posts something bad, it's not like they get banned right away. The moderators actually make a decision about whether or not they're going to leave it or if they're going to delete it, and what are they going to do with the person who posted that content. So there's a lot of complex decision making that happens in this process. And the reason why they spend a lot more time thinking about this is because contrary to places like YouTube or Facebook, on smaller communities, it's really important to maintain the community and make sure you're not alienating people. So there is sometimes these two conflicting purposes. One, you don't want bad content, but at the same time, you don't want to alienate users and push them away. So we find that there's a lot of discussion and education and communication that happens between the moderators and these people who are posting rude content. And surprisingly enough, a lot of times going through these discussions makes people understand about what is appropriate and what is not, and they're able to kind of stay in and kind of convert into good citizens. And this was something that we found was very interesting, because like when we think about people who post bad things online, we think like what kind of bad person does that? But in this research, we found that of course there are some people who are just really rude and they just want to make the internet a bad place for everyone. But some people, especially like the younger folks, they don't really know what is appropriate behavior. And so, and they sometimes think, for example, that saying something rude will get them a lot of attention, and they do that to provoke people. But when they find that they can get attention without being rude, then they have the option to be nice and constructive. So we found that there's a lot of kind of communication and education happening between the moderators and the viewers. And this is a lot of emotional work that the moderators are doing that a lot of people don't realize is happening. So what kind of projects do we have going on in content moderation? These are just, it's really hard to go through every single one in detail. So I just wanted to give you a kind of bird's eye view of what we're doing. So some of our research is, now that we know that human moderators are under a lot of emotional stress, we're trying to develop interventions to reduce their stress. And what this means is that we're trying to design better systems so that when they are in the system, for example, if you are on some kind of software platform where you have to constantly look at images and determine whether they're good or bad, imagine if you're looking at these really nasty images all day. It doesn't do very, it's not really great for your mental health. So in that case, is there a better way to present these things so that, somebody doesn't get as traumatized as they would? Another thing is like, how can we improve the work process? As I mentioned earlier, scalability is a huge issue. There's always going to be more content that is posted on the internet than there are moderators who are able to review it. So there needs to be some kind of AI integration where we develop AI so that it can help out with the moderators, even if there has to be a human at the end of the day. So we're also working a lot in developing different tools and interfaces for moderators to really help help the decision making go a lot easier. And then finally, we also want to understand, like, what do regular users like you, like me, like when we're using social media, what do the people want in terms of content moderation? And this is like it seems very intuitive and kind of like obvious that we should think about what the people want. But until now, actually, there hasn't been a lot of consideration for what the users want. There's been a lot of perception that social media, because it's free, the platforms can do whatever they want. And legally, that is true. Facebook, YouTube, none of these companies are under any legal obligation to do what its users want. However, when you are a platform that has such big societal impact, we should also think about going beyond the legal obligation. Is there a moral obligation if a platform has such a big influence on society? And so we're beginning to ask some of these questions, talking to like regular users and thinking about, asking them, who do you think should be responsible? Or what kind of role can regular users play in terms of trying to help out with content moderation? If you are using a platform for free, does that mean that you should also have some kind of obligation to help out with making it a better place? And of course, there's no right or wrong answer in this, but we're trying to gauge what people think. Also thinking about, like, what are the roles of companies versus government? And this goes kind of beyond the US perspective. If you're thinking about this globally, the way that social media is influenced by the government is very different based on what kind of country you live in. In the US, for example, the government doesn't intervene very much in terms of social media content. But in some other countries, certain apps, certain social media platforms are banned, which like China is a really good example of, like, certain social media platforms are not available or accessible, so they have to develop their own platforms. So we're also looking at a lot of cross-cultural, cross-country comparisons on this. And these are some pictures of my collaborators, my students, and postdoc who have been working with me on these topics. Another aspect that we want to look at is to improve AI. Now, before I said that AI was not perfect, and that's still true. And even with the advancement of AI, I don't think that there's ever going to be a situation where AI can 100% do everything. So then how are we going to have AI try to deal with things that AI is currently not able to do? And in some sense, it's AI will be like one step behind people trying to be creative. But on the other hand, we can develop algorithms to try to combat some of the interesting patterns that we're seeing. So recently, we developed this kind of deep learning model where before I was telling you that if there's an emoji embedded in a word, there is no way for the algorithm to detect whether this is a bad word or not. But we developed this deep learning model so that even if a picture is embedded in a word, the AI can reverse engineer and try to figure out if the picture is replacing a letter. So again, it's not completely perfect in terms of detecting all kinds of hate speech that have emojis in it, but at least it's trying to get at some of the obvious ones. So that's the end of my presentation. Today, I really wanted to give you a bird's eye view of what content moderation looks like in our current social media landscape. And I'd be really happy to answer any questions at this point. Thank you very much. Okay, great. So we have a bunch of questions. So I guess I'll start out with this one on the screen. The question is, what do you think about Facebook's panel of judges for content? Do you think it will work out? That's a great question. I think that ultimately, I think that it cannot come down to a group of, specific individuals to make decisions for everything. Like I said, it's not going to be scalable. But I do think that if they were able to kind of open up this decision-making process and make this more of a public discussion, I think it would be very useful, because what people think is offensive or not is very contextual. Like, for example, something that was not offensive 10 years ago might be very offensive today. And so I think that this needs to be an ongoing conversation. The documentation for what is appropriate and inappropriate needs to be a living document and kind of reflect our values of the time. That's why I also think that, people who are making these decisions need to it needs to be a mix of different people, right? There should be some people who have no conflict of interest with Facebook, who do not care about its monetary success. We need people who are thinking, who are philosophers. We need people who are computer scientists. So I think it's really important to have a diverse group of people think about these issues, but not keep it in a silo, but open it up for public discussion. I think that especially when you're talking about a platform that is so big as Facebook, more than 90% of US of people in the US have a Facebook account, it means that it has a very big impact. I think it's very important for there to be some public discussion and engage some of the users in these decisions. Thank you. That was a great question. Next, we have a question from William Lutz. How do user-moderated communities change the dynamic? For example, Facebook is employee-moderated, but Reddit communities are user-moderated. That's a great question. So like I was saying, the Facebook, we call those moderators commercial content moderators because they're actually paid to moderate, whereas on Reddit, we have unpaid volunteer moderators. The difference in dynamic is for user-moderated communities, the communities come up with their own guidelines. And so they are the ones who decide what is appropriate and what is not. So for example, on Reddit, each subreddit, so Reddit is, of course, one social media, but it's composed of tiny little micro communities. And each subreddit has its own different rules. So what might be acceptable in one is not in the other. And I think this is kind of similar to like what we see in local government, for example. But maybe even that is a big analogy. Like I like to think of these micro communities as like families. For example, like each household has its own rules, right? In some houses, it's okay to call your mom by her first name, but in some houses it's not, right? You have to call mom. So I think the dynamic that changes when we shift to the user-moderated community is that the community actually becomes more involved in deciding what these rules are. And so if they don't like the rules of that community, they go to another community. And of course, from a macro perspective, you might think that, this, of course, breeds for people who are similar to each other. So on the positive side, you have people building like very safe, very positive pro-social communities. On the flip side, when you have people, like-minded people gather together, that's when you get like QAnon and like white supremacist groups. So I think the thing that the user-moderated communities facilitate is you get more homogenous communities who are gatherings of people who are like-minded, who agree with each other, who try to make things work. And in that sense, at the macro level, there will be a little bit more polarization. Thank you. My audio tour asks, I included multilingual and multi-theme capacity in the audio tour platform to promote diversity. Is DEI a social media concern? That's a great question. I think that especially for like tech companies these days, like diversity and inclusion is becoming a more salient topic. I also would like to include accessibility in there as well. Accessibility is a broad term used for not just people who have like physical disabilities, but all kinds of kind of accessibility issues. It's nice that it's becoming a growing concern, but I don't see it being implemented at the very high level of where it's like an absolute priority. But I think that this is going to change because a lot of users, especially I see this among younger users, they care more about kind of what the company represents. And so like diversity and inclusion, like I rarely talk to like older adults or like people around my age who talk about like diversity as being an important thing. But when I talk to like my students, like a lot of them think that diversity is like very important. So I think that, you know, if you're building for a broader audience and like looking towards the future, diversity and inclusion, definitely something that I think should be built into the platform. Obviously, this is just kind of my personal opinion. But what I think is really important is at the end of the day, platforms have their own philosophy, and the philosophy is reflected in the design, and that design influences the users. And so a lot of times, you know, in the past 10, 20 years, a lot of the platforms were designed without any consideration for the social consequences. But because of like, you know, what we've seen about like how like social media influences like big things like elections and social movements, I think there's a growing awareness that you can't just make something and expect that everything will go well. So there needs to be a little bit more consideration into the design. And I think it's really important that we engage like, you know, philosophers and other non-computer scientists into the design process so that we can think about these like intentional and unintentional consequences that our platforms can have. Thank you. Next we have, do you think this is going to drive a breakup of big tech? I don't think that there's going to be, well, I guess it depends on what you mean by breakup, but I think that there's definitely going to be a big paradigm shift. And we're already seeing that, like the fact that Twitter banned Donald Trump is a huge difference. Several years ago, Jack Dorsey, the CEO of Twitter, explicitly, when asked about like, you know, what are you going to do about white supremacists on Twitter? He said that Twitter was a free speech platform and that everybody has the right to say whatever they want. And obviously, he's changed his stance since then. I think that this, and that just goes that, you know, and I think that's okay. I think that's different from flip-flopping. It's this sense that like a lot of, I think that tech companies, like in the beginning, were very naive in thinking about kind of what the platforms do and what free speech means. And I think as they do more investigation into these things, they realize that, you know, everybody just saying what they want to say is not what free speech means. Which, you know, if you talked to historians or social scientists, like it would have been a pretty obvious thing. But a lot of times, you know, people develop things without really thinking about the social consequences, like I mentioned earlier. And so I think that, you know, companies like hiring more people from humanities, I think that's like a big paradigm shift as well. So in short, I don't think it's going to be a breakup, but I do think that there is going to be this kind of a realization that you know, that values matter. And I think that, you know, whatever next company is able to come up with something that has more powerful values that appeals to people, I think it's just a matter of time before people switch off. If you just looking historically, for example, there was a time when everybody was using MySpace. How quickly it disappeared, right? Almost overnight. Everyone was on MySpace and then everyone was not. It's very easy for people to migrate to another platform. And so I think that it's really, there's not going to be a breakup, but there might be some more diversification, and it will be interesting to see what kind of platforms emerge in the future. Next question, following up on the Facebook Reddit question, how does community involvement change with regard to submitting rude or malicious behavior? Do people's behavior change if they know the mod is one of them? In terms of moderation, there are some people who have a good understanding of what the moderation structure is like. For example, on Reddit, there are other people who don't. And the platform plays a role a little bit in terms of, like, for example, on Reddit or Twitch, it is very clear who the moderators are. I think that knowing the moderator is also kind of a user really, I feel that it helps with kind of community building, because the moderator is not some, like, unknown person 10,000 miles away who is just kind of going through content, right? This is somebody who is also, around there from day to day. They're always there. They're also looking at the same content. They're part of the same community. And so I think there's like a bigger tolerance to be willing to listen to people. And that's why I was saying earlier that the moderators engage in a lot of communication and education. And I think that this is something that, would not happen very much if you were kind of dealing with moderators who are kind of hired by the company. It doesn't seem like a meaningful discussion, whereas like if this is someone who's from your community, it feels more like a conversation. Are product comments on e-commerce and review sites in a different category of social media? I would say no. It's not. I would say they're asynchronous. So what that means is, people post something and then someone reviews it later. That could also be subject to content moderation. A lot of times, these are moderated centrally by the site that is providing the review. So, for example, if you submit a review on Amazon, like Amazon might decide to take it down or keep it up. Recently, for example, talking about the whole GameStop fiasco that happened recently, there were a lot of people who were very unhappy with the Robinhood app and posted a lot of negative reviews on Google, and Google removed a bunch of those. That is also an example of content moderation. So definitely there, any time that somebody contributes some kind of creative content online and there's some decision on whether it stays or goes, can be considered content moderation. Can you speak to the differences in moderation behavior around the media type, video versus images versus text? Yeah, this is a very complex question. So obviously I'm not going to be able to answer it in a very short time, but the modality definitely matters. We can also think of something, so text is the most easiest to moderate. And the reason because of that is because a lot of our AI is trained well to detect things in text. Images are harder. Videos are even harder than images, and then audio is a nightmare. And so these platforms that are reliant on video and audio are very difficult to monitor with AI, which is why we see a lot more human moderation happening in those modalities. So I think that I think it just depends on like how fast AIs will be able to develop kind of algorithms to deal with video and images. Currently, text is somewhat well developed, but beyond that is still at a very, very early stage. So there's a lot of room for people who do like computer vision, people who are able to do like audio processing. There's still a lot of growth room there for AI development. How can alumni support your research? Can we connect you or your students with our company? Sure. So we do, I guess it depends on like what kind of capacity you would like to, if you're a social media company or not. We're happy to work with like companies, and we've worked with companies, for example, smaller companies who want to learn about like, what are best practices for moderation. If you are a social media company with data and it's in your terms of service, it's okay for you to use that data for research purposes, we'd be happy to work with you to look at some of the data. We've worked with some companies in the past, for example, where we obtained some of their data and was doing data analysis. Another thing is we're also we have a bunch of students who we're training in different aspects. They're always looking for internships, and so that would also be great. We also have received a lot of private donations as well, and most of this goes towards all of this goes towards research, primarily for giving students scholarships and such. So thank you. These are some of the ways that you could support our research. Tech forum moderation seems to have a long history. Has this been done right? I don't know if you could clarify what you mean by tech forum moderation. Are you talking about online tech, message boards or those kind of online forums? Message board moderation, right? So I mean, content moderation has been around since the beginning of the internet, and online message boards you're absolutely right. That's kind of where a lot of the content moderation, it's been around for 20, 30 years now. A lot of the early technology, for example, like MUDs and MOOCs, those are also places where there was a lot of content moderation. Online forum moderation is very similar in some sense to the volunteer moderation we're seeing on Reddit these days. Reddit is essentially an online message tool. So I think that there's a lot of, and I think that's why Wikipedia and Reddit have fairly good moderation practices, because there's been a lot of knowledge that we have gained from how online message forums were moderated in the past. I think that's why live streaming, live audio, video, these are things that we're still struggling with, because the history of moderation with these kind of more high resolution, high modality, high fidelity technologies is more recent. But you're definitely right. And these text-based forums, they do have a long history. And so I think that's why the moderation practices for those types of communities are more sophisticated.
Thank you, Dr. Wan, for that wonderful presentation. I think it was really informative. We had a lot of great questions from the audience, which we really appreciate. So thank you for all of that. Thank everybody for attending. And again, thank you, Dr. Wan, for the presentation and for being with us today. My name is Dina Anello. I'm the Director of External Relations for the Yingwu College of Computing. Again, thank you to all of our alumni that attended today's event. We'll be doing a few more of these in the coming months, so keep an eye out for invitations and more information on that. We hope you'll join those as well. And I just wanted to reiterate that we are here to work with our alumni. So if you or your organization has any interest in doing work with us at the College of Computing, my contact information is scrolling along the bottom of the screen. Please feel free to contact me about those opportunities, whether it be recruiting, student project work, any type of student engagement activity, where we work with organizations and companies out there. Alumni are a great way to make those connections. So please feel free to contact me with any questions or any interest in any of those activities, and we'd be happy to work with you and work with your organization. So again, I thank you all for being here today and for taking time out of your day to be with us. It was a great session, and keep an eye out for a few more coming for the remaining of the semester with a few other faculty members from the Yingwu College of Computing.
Dina, thanks so much. So again, this has been our latest Highlander chat, the Toxic Network with Dr. Yvette Wan from the Yingwu College of Computing. As a reminder to all of our viewers, you'll be able to see and hear this video cast and podcasts on Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Facebook, and LinkedIn, among a number of other locations. If you're interested in contacting Dr. Wan, please email alumni@njit.edu, and we will be happy to pass along your questions. In the meantime, as I always like to say, go Highlanders.